coming to you live from the 14th floor of the Chancery Building in downtown Denver. It is the Eternal Designer Mailbag Q&A. Andrew Baeckstrom, Patrick Sullivan, whether you're joining us on Discord, Twitch, some illegal service I don't know about, really appreciate you taking the time to join us. If you've been following this at all, you know we've been asking for questions from people to talk about both sort of to hone in on the last live balance changes, which were pretty substantial, and also sort of broadly to open up the floor to just questions about the game in general, specifically the design elements that Andrew and I can speak to. We have a list of questions that we've curated off of our Discord that are ready to go, and then time permitting, we're going to kind of open up the floor to questions live from our Discord and Twitch. So thank you for joining us. And Andrew, thank you for joining me as well and putting together this list of questions.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So we could jump right in because there's a lot of them and I don't want to waste anyone's time. So first off question, let's start off with one of the big ones.
Just a real quick thing before we dive in. We are going to have a question up on the screen here so you can follow along. These are truncated versions. People send us questions that are very lengthy. And so we want to be able to put up sort of a short version up on the screen here without giving the impression that we're trying to edit anyone's question. So we'll be reading the full version out loud. And so you can follow along if you're, not really paying too close of attention. We'll have sort of a Cliff Notes summary question up on the screen here that we're speaking to.
That's a great point. All right, so you ready for the first one?
Ready to go.
Let's do it. All right, so KidSneeLock asked, what did Transpose do to you? So obviously they're speaking to the fact that Transpose, one of the most popular cards in the game in the Throne format, up until very recently perhaps, got a pretty significant nerf in last week's balance patch. And so I guess they kind of want to know, like, why did we kind of hit that one so hard, and why did we think it was important maybe to pull back on that one in a substantial way?
Well, sort of from a top level, I think before we hone in on that individual card, there are reasons sometimes that we want to go relatively hard on cards. The two sort of, broad reasons to do it. One is sometimes it's just off by that much. Sometimes it's impossible to kind of negotiate it down to adjacent but still not problematic. Or, we're reticent to want to do a second or third nerf to cards. So sometimes it's a measure twice, cut once sort of thing. There's another element to it where either sometimes the card is perceived as being at odds with long-term goals, and or we want to make sure that the metagame feels meaningfully different in the aftermath. And sometimes that means we have to go harder than we normally do on cards, or harder than we have to, however you want to quantify that. But I think Transpose absolutely falls into that basket of all those reasons being at play here. I don't know if we want to drill down too much into each specific thing, but there's a constellation of considerations at play there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, but obviously we've talked about this before this stream.
Right.
When we were working on the most recent balance patch, and I think something that people probably would guess is that last week's balance patch was not sort of like us coming in a week or two before and being like, hey, what do we think we might want to do to try to shake up Throne, try to reframe what are some of the key play patterns, some of the key cards of that format. And we always want to do so in a way that we get time to investigate, explore what these alternate worlds might be like, what are the things that we're trying to accomplish. And I think that if you're a player who's maybe played against a lot of decks which with relics, or where they were trying to protect it with a transpose right when you were trying to pop their relic, the fact that the card could go and search up a wide array of effects at 4 and sometimes be used to put together combos, and the Aegis was sort of protecting the combo. It was a pretty recurring pattern in the game that Transpose was just doing an enormous amount for one cost, and in particular that sort of play pattern of like, I'm trying to kill your relic, you play a Transpose, and now I can't necessarily play anything back in order to sort of wipe out the Aegis in time, was a thing where it's like, let's rethink what's going on here with fast Aegis.
And I think before we move on to the next question, I think that's a really good point about player Aegis, and something that we're constantly monitoring is this promoting or pulling away from interaction? And the details matter a lot. If people are playing with a lot of discard effects, let's say, and you have ways of giving yourself Aegis to protect your hand, that's great in some doses. if it's more about, well, you can't blow up this relic and I'm assembling the shop that you can't interact with profitably or even at all in some cases, that's much more worrisome. And where we are in that sort of spectrum of outcomes with player ages is likely to push and pull over time. And there are times where we're going to want to step back from that a little bit, and there's some times where we're going to want to amplify that depending on what's going on. And I think the metagame got to a point where it was just an experience we were looking to tone down a little bit.
Yeah. All right, next up, from spiffirific, exactly what data/metrics are the devs looking at when making balance decisions? Sometimes certain buffs or nerfs seem like they're coming out of left field, and it would be interesting to know the exact rationale behind individual card changes. Would it be possible for some of these data metrics to be visible to the public? Things that come to mind include percentage of the player base playing with individual cards, win rates, etc. So, yeah, I guess for the people at home, what sort of numbers do we start looking at, and how do those fit into the conversations that we have about how to adjust things in the game?
Well, there's sort of two broad things that we look at. One is the win rate of the card, and the two is its metagame share. That's what you'd probably naturally assume. How much are people playing with the card, and how much does the card win? And then we try to isolate that for different ELO bands because more inexperienced players or newer players, certain commons and uncommons are more likely to be the problematic cards in that space because they don't necessarily own all the high rarity cards. And that answer can be different as you go, and often is different as you go up into the higher ELO bands. But it's just one element among many. Sometimes what we're looking at, the data kind of confirms our own intuitions by monitoring conversations and playing on live ourselves. Sometimes we see something that really doesn't match our intuitions, and it's like, oh, we need to investigate this because no one in the room would have guessed that card X was our most winning card on live right now, or that this sigil was winning at 55% or whatever those lines are. But it's really rare that there's like a bright line as far as the numbers go where it's like, once it hits this, we take action. Either with representation or win rate. It's just one piece of the puzzle to try to come up with the best, live metagames we can come up with.
Yeah, I mean, in the most simple sense, a lot of times when cards emerge as being maybe stronger or having an effect that the players perceive as undesirable, we might perceive as undesirable, it can be tricky because cards work together.
Right.
And so if it's A plus B equals something we don't like, well, you could adjust A, you could adjust B, or maybe there's something else going on. And so in the case, I think, of this most recent patch, a big theme for us was, with Throne, with sort of how many, we've now put out thousands of cards into the game, great variety of strategies. And some of the strategies, I would say, are quite difficult to anticipate and react to. I think people at home could guess a few that we're hinting at, but, and so for us, like trying to make it, let's rethink some of these over-the-top combo approaches in the game. Not that we don't want combo and things like that, but there's a whole bigger picture to all of this. If you're spending all of your time trying to catch up against the ultra-fast blazing Savo decks, do you have time to worry about this deck and try to beat these things? And that's not entirely what the game's about, but all of these things come together, and so we're always trying to manage as best we can the complete picture. Even if you zoom in on any given piece, you might be like, well, why that and not this?
Right, yep. These are fluid conversations. There's not one thing we hone in on, I guess is the short answer. It's all part of a big tapestry of what creates calls to action or what causes us to say, this is fine, we can leave it be.
Yep. From AlexandrosGray, are you planning to make Ask the Devs a regular or semi-regular thing? More communication is always welcomed. Well, first of all, it's important to note before we get this that I really like talking to Patrick. It's a lot of fun. It's really super useful for my job and for the team's job. So I will object very hard to making him too available to all of you.
Yeah, I don't think we're at risk of that, but all this is this is our first time doing something like this, so we can't promise anything. But the expectation is we're going to do more of this, and we would like to. I think this is a great way of engaging with the community. I think the questions that we receive give us a lot of food for thought in terms of topics that are on the community's mind or things to be considering as we're making our sets. So I think it's useful for our players. I think it's useful for us as well. But all this is sort of TBD. But I would expect we're gonna do it. But no promises just yet.
Yep. I mean, it's great. We're back at the office now. At least like most companies, we've been negotiating the work from home stuff, but We're back here every day rocking and rolling at the office. And so the idea of popping in here on a semi-regular basis and catching up with y'all sounds like a pretty good time to me.
Yep.
So AlexFiero was curious about sort of the changes that we didn't make. So when working on these changes, how much were the Elysian / Kira decks considered? It seems there was no changes targeted at them, despite being some of the best performing decks in the Throne metagame. So yeah, I mean, I think that's, first of all, it's a great point, in the sense of, like, we've certainly seen Elysian spells, and so I assume Alex is speaking to these sort of like Master Conjurer style of decks that we've seen, and then with Kira, potentially maybe in the Haru space, we've seen that. At least for the Haru Kira deck, I would say they're both decks that we have our eye on. Both of those decks are capable of taking an early advantage and really putting the game and snowballing it almost away before the other player can kind of get a chance to interact and catch up. They're very good. They're very flexible. Strong decks, and I think that we're never going to be in a spot where we're going to be saying like anything's going to get nerfed. If we thought that those cards needed to get nerfed and changed in order for the game to be fun and healthy, we would, but we're going to be keeping an eye, just as you all, at the Throne Open coming up this weekend, and we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it for me is if it's a tiebreaker, if it's a close call, which I think we could have taken action on something here. It wouldn't have been the most surprising thing. It's just has the joke gotten old yet? I really don't think we've hit that point with the Elysian stuff that's being alluded to, and some of the other stuff that we went harder at. I think the duration that it's been good, the duration that the cards in the deck haven't changed much, is a huge factor in deciding to take action. So
Yeah.
we're again, we're going to keep a lookout for it. It wouldn't surprise me if it was a really top performing deck in this weekend's tournament, but it wasn't quite at the boiling over point where we felt that action was necessary.
All right, so from Patomaru, curious, what do we love most about IlyaK?
Passionate, cares. Yeah. I think, from my own perspective, I think a lot of his posts, 4 or 5 years ago, were much more in the like, well, then by your logic, well, didn't you say this and that? And that's really receded a lot in my more recent interactions and observing his interactions with others. So I love that people are passionate. I love that people care. I love that this is a thing that they enjoy, even if sometimes the critiques come off in a way that's hostile or not entirely fair, which everyone does with the things they care about. It's not like unique to him or anyone else, but having people that are that invested, that care that much, is like, that's great. I've worked on games where the opposite was going on, and let me tell you, that is worse. So,
and we're both from New Jersey.
Yeah,
so
I could take I could take a little ruffling of the feathers. I've dealt with worse.
Yeah.
My whole life, so
yeah,
I'll be okay.
And we've been around gamers our whole life, and the idea that somebody might occasionally use some amount of hyperbole to get a point across is something that we're used to.
Philly, New York.
Yeah.
Shout out IlyaK.
All right, so speaking of IlyaK, we got a question from him up next. Why are reverts on cards that were nerfed and no longer see play, example, Heart of the Vault, Bullet Shaper, Desecrate, so conservative, but nerfs that put them in that state are so heavy? Can the meta change with more emphasis on positive changes as opposed to, I guess, buffs, reverts, partial reverts, along with the nerfs? So, yeah, first of all, like, occasionally we do that. I would say the reason why we tend not to maybe revert a nerf as often as maybe players at home would maybe expect is that when we're changing a card, it's not purely just a reaction to this card is winning a lot in the format. It might be we test these cards a lot. We try to get a really good sense of them, but then we put them out on the wild for everyone at home to play. And then you all, there's only so many of us here playing so many hours with them. We're changing them a lot, so we're not playing a million games with them in their final form every single time. And then you guys go out and play a million games with them. And so when that happens, sometimes we end up discovering, you know what, maybe we thought this card would be appropriate to sort of be a format staple, a foundational kind of tool, and we end up coming to the conclusion that maybe we want to pull back and have this one be maybe a little bit more of a role player in the format. And so even though maybe as the power in the game scales up, we do occasionally find spots where it's like, okay, now we can maybe get this back one to where we always sort of liked it in the case of Vicious Highwayman recently. But maybe in the case of some of these other cards, it's not necessarily the case where it's going to be so easy to be like, well, now it's great for this card to just be defining tier 1.
Yeah, there's a couple factors at play there. One is for our cards that are kind of at the tippy top of the power level that get nerfed, there is a very good chance that we played internally with the nerfed version before the card came out.
Yep.
And we have a sense of what the power level and fun of that card is. And sometimes we're happy saying, you know what, that's actually a better world, a more sustainable world. We have familiarity with it, and we're happy just like letting this one go. And if we like 80% of what's going on here, but we don't like 20%, instead of trying to like keep mixing the salt and pepper to get it right, we can always make new cards that are similar that actually have the functionality that we want. In the case of something like Vicious Highwayman, whether that card is buffed or nerfed is often a function of Stone Scar broadly rather than that card specifically. And so sometimes there's like collateral damage or collateral buffs that don't necessarily speak to is Vicious Highwayman problematic or not right now, but rather what is it sort of in the shape of the entire ecosystem? What is Stone Scar's place in the metagame? And does it need a little pumping up or toning down? And that's just one where we know toggling that dial either way is really effective.
And I think something that can be certainly hard to appreciate if you aren't here with us is that there's a lot of cards that we hear about from the community that it's like, I wish you would bring this one back. And whatever ones you think you all are talking about a lot in terms of bringing back, they're the ones that come up a lot here. And for us, it oftentimes isn't a case of like, well, they like this thing, but it's a bad thing to like. It's like, no, it's cool that they like this card. It's cool that they like cards that play this way. Maybe we can't necessarily get it back to the power level it once was, but to us, and that's a thing that when we're working on future sets and future card files, it's like, oh, do you remember this card or this card? And I don't want to say any individual one and make think something's coming back or anything, but the idea of like, we're going to try to recapture when you talk about a card that you really liked.
Right, yep.
All right, so great question from Ilya. From Blackhaven, was it ever considered to have Mentor trigger Renown effects? So Renown was a mechanic keyword that we had in set 5, Defiance, and this was such a cool question for me to pick out because it was like, was this somebody who used to work here? Because this was something that was like a real active topic of conversation when we were working on this mechanic. And so for people at home who don't remember, I'll just refresh you. Mentor was a sort of a summon effect on some units and some spells where you would exhaust the unit to give it a bonus, exhaust another unit to give it a bonus, and then Renown ended up playing out as a bonus that a unit could get when you played a spell or weapon directly on it. And so it kind of feels natural for a Mentor card to unlock a Renown card.
So there was a lot of factors that went into this one. I think from a purely gameplay standpoint, I'm personally, your mileage may vary. I know designers have different, feelings on this sort of thing. I really like encouraging different card types. I think decks are a lot more interesting when it's not 25 power 50 units, but you have some weapons and you have some relics and you have some spells and you have some units. So Mentor working with Renown is at odds with that goal because now you're triggering your stuff off of units. Maybe your deck is now, if not all units, more units than it would have been otherwise. I think there's some dissonance with the story, which is Renown is sort of like, this is the star of the show moment. And Mentor has this like almost, well, this is the student. This is someone learning something. So the creative conceit, I think, is a little bit worse. And then lastly, what is the reminder text on Renown if you have it work that way? It's like it starts getting into really fuzzy territory of what is actually, like, what would you actually write on the card? Whenever you play a card that causes you to click on this, it starts getting.
We didn't want.
The actual rules start getting a little hard to actually describe in plain language.
Yeah, and I think it was a fun feature of that format, and when Renown was more popular in that limited format, that you would be on the lookout for weapons and maybe a deck that wouldn't, because now you're getting this bonus that normally you wouldn't associate when you're playing a weapon strategy. And all that sort of mixing and matching and shaking up some of the fundamentals is a fun thing for us to do, and I think a fun thing to play. In the case of Mentor and Renown, if we had it work with this, the next natural question is, well, why doesn't it work with this other ability? Why doesn't it work with this unit that has a summon to give the thing +3/+3?
Why does it work with Paladin Oathbook?
Yeah.
It's just it starts getting actually describing the mechanics of it in plain language becomes very difficult at a certain point.
And it's not that we don't think that our players, a lot of you at home, particularly who are watching this, could handle that kind of complexity, but we always, making a digital game, we want to make it super fast, easy, and simple. Annihilate's a pretty easy card to play with because you know what happens when you drag that out on a card that isn't single faction? You can't play it. But maybe you use a mentor card, maybe you use one of these other effects that doesn't work with the mechanic, you play them thinking it's going to proc Renown, all of a sudden it doesn't, and now it's like, oh, I need to slow up.
Right.
And we always want to make it so easy and simple that you could just play.
But that's a great question. I mean,
yeah,
as you mentioned, that one's like suspicious, like someone's got a burner account who used to work here or something. Because that was a topic that was discussed at length at the time. That was not an easy call, but I stand by having the two keywords not work together.
And that's part of why making games and working on games can be so fun, but also at times like it's a lot, because all of these factors that we're talking about were, we did the 5-minute very short version. This was something that played out over months with lots and lots of conversations. And, if you enjoy going through all that, great, but not for everyone. All right, CaptainTeembro, if my best guess is correct, and even decks make up a majority of this throne tournament, will Even Handed Golem finally be changed in a way that won't punish overwhelmingly reward its deck's pilots and opponents based on whether they have an even-handed golem on turn 2. So obviously even-handed golem was a popular topic of conversation. This card been around for a while, consistently flowed, either been like near or at tier 1, has been changed. And I think it's worth unpacking a little bit about like what's going on with the card, why is the card an interesting thing to have in the game, and what sort of, first of all, for people who might not appreciate, what value do you see as what Even-Handed Golem brings?
It's a really loud way of encouraging people to play with cards and strategies they otherwise wouldn't. There's a lot of cards you can describe that sort of way, and I think in general, things that are a little bit more, if not artful, at least mechanically driven than referencing cost is my preferred way of doing it. But I think there's some room for this as well. I also think that the card has a habit of encouraging decks that are pretty interactive and, if not play long games, at least aren't playing particularly short games. I think it gives context to cards with, say, activated abilities that cost an odd amount of power, being particularly appealing for people who are playing even strategies in a way that doesn't necessarily have spillover for other decks. So there's a lot of positive things going on here. It is really powerful. At a certain point, like I kind of said earlier, the joke gets old with all of this stuff. And the more and more that the even-handed archetype kind of just distills down into one set list rather than here's a smattering of different decks that are using even-handed golem, I think the case to take action becomes more and more powerful. But broadly, I think it encourages things that are positive. I think it's had a overall like net positive, not close impact on eternal deck building and playing of the game, but it's also really, really good. And anytime it's a card that like people just mulligan for in the dark, basically, that is cause for concern. So it's something that we're watching all the time, but it's also at a baseline, I think, something that's worth, if it's at an acceptable rate of representation and at win rate, it's something I'd rather have be there than not.
Yeah, and a question like this is it's a topic that, we like to always say that, we're going to have a conversation here and the stream's going to be over, but a lot of this stuff, it'll continue, whether it's stuff that we're talking about, working with the team on, conversations that'll be going on for future sets. And when the case of Even-Handed Golem, it's a card where it's like, if you're at home and you're saying like, it's very frustrating that I feel like I can't unlock how to beat this. It's like, okay, well, what do we need to do in order to give you tools that can better help you with this? And specifically, how do we make it so that the Even-Handed Golem experience, if people want to go down that route, that let's try to make sure that what they're doing is they're trying to build an actual deck that has pieces that you interact with, that has a game plan, it has a strategy that you're working on. It's not just about like, let me see how many times I can even-handed golem and draw the most cards, and then I guess once I have the most good cards in my hand, I'll win the game. And if the case is that it's easy for you to just win by just having the most cards in your hand, maybe that's even-handed golem's fault, but maybe it means that there's other aspects, things of the format that we want to relook at and re-examine.
Totally. I mean, there's that spectrum again of, is it greasing the wheels for you doing something cool and unique, or is one end of the spectrum, and the other is, are you just arbitrarily burying your opponent with extra cards, and it kind of doesn't matter what you're drawing as long as you're just outdrawing them by that much. And the more that Even Handed Golem is over on this side, the more likely you are to take action, and the more that it's over here, the more it's like, well, can we identify the actual strategy that's being executed here and give people pieces that are satisfying against it? If it's just a sort of a, agnostic, just churn of resources and burying your opponent, that's way more likely to result in direct action from us.
So AdequateFinch got a question about combo. We love our combo players. Where does combo fit in the DWD philosophy on what constitutes a healthy metagame?
Well, I think you have to start with how are you defining combo?
That is actually always the right way to start any conversation about combo, because the definition's wide.
There is one definition, a really narrow one, which is just, it's two cards together that cause you to, if not win the game, then essentially win the game. And then there's a much more broad definition that's sort of like, are you playing with unorthodox game pieces that are greater than the sum of its parts? Really don't like the first thing, really like the second thing. The more that the second thing is about putting pieces into play or creating a strategy such that even if you're not prepared to specifically, let's say relics as an example, maybe I can't play with a bunch of ruins because there's just not enough ruin targets out there. But if my opponent's playing with rat cages and my lightning storms and just units that attack and block make an interactive game, that's great. And then if I happen to play with ruins, my win rate goes way up because it's like specifically good against that. That's a really good place to be in. But I'm sitting around just, drawing cards and ramping my resources. And then here in one turn, here is dumping out my hand, monopolizing the clock. And now it's just a race against the rope or whatever. That is not something that I want to encourage. I don't think that's a good two-player game. I don't think that's a good digital experience. I don't think that's a good mobile experience. And so I guess to circle back, it kind of depends on how you're defining combo. But we want unorthodox play patterns to have a place, but the details really matter a lot in exactly what we consider to be positive and what we consider to be negative.
Yeah. A big factor, I think, is also with when we're talking about combo, is sort of like, how quickly does this get wrapped up? Your opponent signed up for the game. They came to play a game. We hope that the game can resolve in a timely fashion. And, it's not that it isn't cool on occasion to see a deck go off and just dump out 1 million piercing griefs, and then the next turn it dumps out 1 million. But all these animations are taking some time, and the health totals are getting out of control. And at a certain point, it's like, how can we help this game progress to a dramatic and fitting conclusion?
I also think transparency is a big part of it too, from my perspective. The sitting around and accruing resources and I'm not doing anything until I'm killing you in one flourish, and now you didn't know what the joke was the whole time and now it's being presented to you. I don't think that experience is really that good. But rat cage is like, you play a rat cage early and it's okay, I have a sense of what's going to be going on in this game. Even I don't know exactly what you're going to be up to, I have a sense of your broad strategy, other pieces you might have, card types that are likely to be represented, and then we play a fairly long game with me having that information. I think that's a lot more satisfying than the surprise you're dead sort of 2-card combo kill experience.
Yeah, and I think it wasn't in this most recent patch, but we pulled back on Stained Honor, and I think that's a great example of the kind of thing that we're talking about, where the way that was playing out was, users were playing with a 3-card combo where each piece costs 2, and then when you dug into it, what was often happening was, once I have 6 power, I'm going to go A plus B plus C. All in one turn, all that happened. Now, we pulled back on the cost of Stained Honor a little bit. And now the reality is you could still do it. That's still that first turn. You have 6 power. But you're going to have to plan around getting the Stained Honor down potentially because it costs more, or wait till longer in the game until you can play all 3 pieces where it might be a more appropriate turn. And there's a variety of ways. And the thing that we want to do is in some ways reward the skill, because it's not even that hard to be like, oh, I wonder what I should do with this combo that I can hold all the pieces in and play in one turn. But if you want to play with Stained Honor, what can you do? Is there a way you can get it Aegis? Is there a way you can play with sabotages? Is there a way that you can bait the removal on something? And those sorts of experiences is sort of more of the direction that we want to go with combo and how we're trying to build it into the game.
Yeah, and that Stained Honor nerf is a perfect example of, one, the interaction that the opponent gets is a lot more satisfying because either the game has to go on for a really long time, or you had to put the shields down for a turn, or you have to set up a protection piece, as you're mentioning. There's some other thing going on. And second, there's transparency. when I play Stand Under and say go, the cat's out of the bag. And now you know exactly what's going on, and maybe you can interact with in some sideways way as well, even if you don't have a way to directly remove the Stand Honor. So that sort of nerf sort of speaks to both of those elements at the same time.
All right, Tempest Dragon King's got a question about exploit. What is your whole plan on handling exploit now that Face Aegis is gone? Well, obviously, you know, there's still ways to gain Phase Aegis in the game. Snowstorm Druid's still there for the taking, and a bunch of other cards.
They're just
but
not as good.
I get what
they're
you're saying.
They're
there.
They're just not as good.
Not there for them anymore. But let's talk about exploit, because obviously that's, you know, been a super prevalent card in both the Expedition and Throne metagames. And, you know, I think, so on the one hand, let's first just talk maybe for a second about the positives about a card like exploit. Mm-hmm. For players who want to prioritize getting the opportunity to interact with whatever their opponent is doing, it gives them an option. It gives them a way to do that. And especially if you know, for all the combo players out there, the people who want to play very divergent, weird decks, unitless strategies, all of those sorts of things, having some tools that players can play, which works really well against a lot of things, but isn't necessarily about killing you, is an important component to the game. Now, of course, we're no stranger to what can be maybe some of the downsides of that experience, in the sense of it's not always the most fun thing to have a piece ripped out of your hands that you were hoping to play with in the game. And maybe you're not a combo player, but you just really were hoping to be able to play this Tavrot or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that to the extent that there's a solution to exploit, I think it's giving satisfying competition at 2 cost, right? I think part of what's going on right now is that the value over replacement of that card against whatever else you could be doing on turn 2 is so high that, like, for all the reasons that you're saying, and also just like it's just abstractly the best thing to be doing, or among the best things to be doing, along with all the bonuses that you're describing. I think that we can, if not get the card out of people's decks, maybe it's so powerful that people just kind of play it in perpetuity, at least make the opportunity cost higher of making it feel like, well, my opponent played a unit on turn 2 and my turn 2 was exploit. That's good, but I'm actually kind of behind right now a little bit, and now I had to play some catch up. You know, I think those are sort of sideways ways that we can get the scales closer to equilibrium than necessarily having to nerf the card, because I think there's a lot of positive things to that design being among the more powerful cards in the game.
And, you know, at the end of the day, what is exploit? In reality, it's basically a 1-for-1. And if you want to beat a 1-for-1, there's ways to do that. For instance, what 2-for-1s are you playing with? Because I promise you, you know, maybe this isn't your personal cup of tea, and maybe there's another kind of 2-for-1 you want, but I'm just giving you my experiences from playing a lot of games over the years. It's like you play with like Twin Brood Sauropod or, you know, Wisdom of the Elders, and I bet you the person playing exploit against you feels a lot less good about the way that the pace of the game is going if they take one piece, but you're accumulating more pieces and you're finding ways to gain value in the game.
Yeah, exactly. The more that your pieces are sort of flat, replaceable, and have implicit 2-for-1s baked in, the less something like exploit matters. Now, we don't want that to be the only way people build decks.
Right.
Just to say that there are tools that people can go to other than player Aegis to dampen the impact of that card against their deck.
And none of this is, of course, with any of these questions, is ever meant to be like, we're in absolutely the perfect situation with exploit right now. If you've got an issue with it, that's your problem. In reality, is we're telling you a little bit about our approach. And if you're saying I'm frustrated, I feel like I'm having trouble beating exploit, being better at it, we hear you, and we'll see what we can do about it.
I believe you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe you.
Yes.
So you don't have to convince us. There's just, I think there's a lot of ways to approach the problem in a way that isn't totally heavy-handed, totally isn't, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But we have to be mindful of, are we giving people the right mixture of satisfying counterplay and enough competition at that power cost such that exploit isn't always the best thing someone can be doing on the second turn.
And we don't want to play whack-a-mole with this stuff.
No.
It's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. This month, exploit's getting nerfed. Next month, oh, it looks like the combo decks are really strong right now. I wonder what's going on. Like, and then we're hitting that, and now it's like, well, now we've managed to make the players who enjoyed playing with exploit and the combo players, and I wonder what'll happen next month, and the fallout from that'll be. And so we're trying to always build towards like a very harmonious world, if you want to go that way.
Yeah.
But trust us. If you think it isn't very tempting for us when we get feedback like, oh, why can't you just get rid of this card? It's making me so mad, for us to just be like, yeah, let's do it.
There's just, there's a lot of it's like a higher functioning, not nearly as bad, the Mr. Burns's body sort of thing of like, you can't just pull these things sometimes you pull out one of these pieces, even if it seems like obviously problematic or doesn't play that well. And there's this whole ecosystem of checks and balances that could fall out of whack if you pull out one of these pieces. On top of it just sort of being generally destabilizing. So we're aware that it's super strong. It being super strong comes with pluses and minuses. So let's find ways to amplify the pluses and push back on the minuses rather than necessarily having to nerf the card or change it in some fundamental way.
Yeah, and if we're going to have to make changes that are like really big and impactful, in some respects, it could. I would think that our perspective is that it could be a little nicer to do them at the same time.
Right.
For instance, we go and hit the Blazing Salvo aggro decks by taking down their piece, but maybe you feel a little less targeted, but guess what? The Transpose people, the Garden of Omens people, the Talir people, they all got a little bit of...
Everyone took a pay cut.
Yeah.
So even if you're down a little bit, other people might be down worse.
But there were some buffs, too, as we've seen people playing with.
It's true. It's true.
All right. Nimrod222 got a question for us. Are there plans to visit the older tribes that don't get attention yet, like Renanans and Valks? So referring to a recent trip to Bastion, giving a view of some Grenadins and Valkyries from another world, a.k.a. Yetis, Wisps, Radiants, even dinosaurs and dragons seem to have gone under the radar as of late. So someone's interested in some tribal.
Yeah, all this stuff. Well, so there's two things is just sort of from a creative standpoint, what's their representation in a given set? And then there's the second mechanical, like what are you doing to make Grenadins matter? Those are two different things. To the first thing, I think from the creative standpoint, we're always kind of trying to balance the like these things are part of the world, they're iconic, and people are fans of them. But we have a lot of world we're trying to show. We're trying to show different story arcs and different worlds and continents and whatever, where sometimes it makes some sense to dial certain things up, and sometimes it makes sense to dial certain things down. And so if you see a set or two come where your favorite unit type isn't really represented as much, that doesn't mean we're just throwing it in the back burner or forgotten about it. It's just we have a lot of creative mouths to feed, and we can't always show everything in the same saturation and the same representation that we've shown every single time. To the mechanical part of it, we have to be cautious with it. I think there is a lot to be said for a deck like that's all Yetis. People are gravitate towards the Yetis as a creative trope, as having a certain like art style. Obviously, it has its fans, but also that stuff can be like pretty homogenous. It's very hard to get away from the incentive of play nothing but Yetis once you make a card like Wump. And we'd like a little bit of that, but we don't want that to be the only way decks get constructed or the only way to build unit-centered decks. So we like a little bit of it, but it's sort of an ongoing conversation of to what extent do we really want to be subsidizing decks that are nothing but a particular unit type versus, something like Ally, for example, which, you obviously want to play dinosaurs in your dinosaur ally deck, but you're not priced into playing 40 dinosaurs. And where's the equilibrium of those incentives supposed to be? I think it's still kind of a work in progress.
Yep, and I think the other thing is that, we want to strike a balance. We want to deliver these tribal experiences, but we also want to explore new You mentioned seeing the world more, and recently we got to do some soldier tribal stuff. We did some mandrakes. The mandrakes are particular favorite of mine, but we love all of our unit types in the game. I don't think we have any of them marked for extinction yet. We got plans for all of them, and part of it also is that like when there is an evocative tribe in the game that we have people have found fans of, we want to make sure is that when we come back and when we're doing more cards on it and we're going deep on it again, is that we have maybe also a new take, a new twist on the experience. We want to make sure that we aren't just really saying like trying to just play the hits and be like, you all like Yetis? Well, here's some more Yetis that look like the Yetis you've seen before. And I think you saw that with the Grenadin that we saw on Bastion. They're much more of these. They've been modified into being animals. They've got spell damage things going on. They're showing up in Primal. There's all sorts of different things going on. And when we're going to take on Tribal, it's like, what can we do that's cool that we haven't done before?
And I think that's a great point there, especially when you start bleeding them over into new factions. One, it's like such a powerful creative story of like what's happened to the world such that this a unit type that's typically only been in A and B now shows up in C. And third, from a just deck building perspective, wow, is it novel to, oh, this unit type hasn't shown up in Justice before. Not only do I want to play this, but now I look at all these Justice cards I've never considered before to find the ones that synergize with the unit type that I'm trying to build around. So I think there's a lot of value to be gained from resurfacing these unit types, but doing a fresh spin on it, both for creative novelty's sake and also because I think the deck construction is a lot more engaging when we tap into some of that stuff.
All right, so next up we got a question from Iron Man here, and I think this is our longest question. It's going to be summed up with just, are you happy with the variance? But I just want everyone to know it's a little longer, but it's a good question, so we want to get to it. About variance, is the dev team happy with the type amount of potential, often game-deciding variance that is introduced by cards like Openway Supplier and Azindal Mastermind, or random card creation like Invoke? It feels as a player that a lot of agency, especially in expedition formats, which are often slower, more value-based, is taken away if games are decided by this kind of card RNG on competitively used designated cards. Who hits the better card with Killer and then can potentially recur it a few times? Openway Supplier into Killer, Sandstorm Titan on Curve is a personal fan favorite. Or in the Incarnus format, who rolls better Invokes? Just to clarify, this is not about all on-card RNG, e.g. transform cards like Equivocate or Unstable Form were always part of the game and feel more balanced in the risk cost than having less stats on a +1 power unit for a potential game-winning effect. So a lot to take in, but sort of how do we feel about variance overall in the game and sort of some of the topics about more loud variance experience like Openway Supplier, like Invoke?
I think it's important to sort of identify variance not just as like a literal function of who is winning the game, but also are we presenting situations and states that are novel that you haven't encountered before. Openway Supplier into Sandstorm Titan is a really powerful sequence a lot of the times, but the presence of Openway Supplier is ostensibly informing cards you are and are not playing with, and as you know, you just watch our more competitive tournaments, you play at the top levels of our ladder and what have you. Players, consciously or not, are playing around that sort of distribution of range, the possibility of their opponent spiking versus something like Openway Supplier being further down the deck and what the different permutations are of that sort of outcome. And so it isn't just we're picking up a bunch of dice and rolling them. There is random circumstances that you encounter the same way that drawing a card off of your deck is a random outcome, and Invoke much the same way. You're making a selection among a randomly distributed set of cards. There is opportunities for players to play well under those circumstances. That is a different skill set than other skill sets, but it's a skill set nonetheless. And if it's adding a lot of novelty to the game and replayability, that's really positive. What we don't want is the experience of someone feeling that the game was illegitimate, that the random spikes were really the thing that determined the game. Now, if we indulge this sort of stuff, every once in a while that will be the thing that happens. But for example, the mulligan system and the initial power in your hand is a conceit of like, we don't want the game decided like this. There is a level of randomness or a manifestation of randomness that we do not like, that feels illegitimate or frustrating. So that stuff we're really mindful of. But things that just add novelty or different distributions of events and outcomes, where there's still a ton of counterplay, where there's still opportunity for players to leverage skill, even if it is random or sometimes like random. It is a random thing. I think that stuff can be really positive even as a part of our Tier 1 metagame.
Yeah, I mean, more skillful players tend to perform well in unusual circumstances and different circumstances. Lots of people can learn how to do the same thing over and over again. You can literally teach a chicken how to play tic-tac-toe. Why? Because it's so simple. The games never are different. Now, part of the thing with you make the games different, it means some of the games are going to be different in ways that you didn't always predict, expect, or even would hope for. But overall, we are always striving to give players very satisfying different games. And so, you know, one of the reasons why Invoke isn't just get a random shadow card, but it's see 3 different random shadow cards, one of each type, is that gives, and then you get one of them, is that now there's this skill element that's more loudly interacting with exactly what's going on with which card you're going to get and then how you use it and what your deck is up to.
Or just look at draft. I mean, in a game of Constructed, you play your first 2 or 3 power. I probably have a sense of what your deck you're playing. By the time you've played your first or second non-power card, I almost certainly know. In draft, that's not the case at all. You play your first couple of power, you play your first unit. I don't know anything about what's in your deck. I don't know what your best rares are. I don't know about what your combos are. You play an open way supplier, like that could land on anything. You know that it's not just landing on 4 cost sentinels like it is in constructed or whatever. And yet, in spite of that, draft remains incredibly skill testing, in spite of the ambiguity, which leads me to believe that the ambiguity is actually part of the skill that's being manifested about playing around a distribution of all outcomes with a lot of uncertainty about what specifically is going on. And I think it's analogous to a lot of the things that you see with Invoke and some of the Warcry and Warcry adjacent mechanics we occasionally do.
Well, I was hoping this stream was really going to bring us all together, and I don't want to open up the can of worms of which is more skill testing for chat to decide, draft or constructed.
It's just a thing to think about.
I'm
not saying,
thing to think about.
I'm just, there's different skills, and it is obvious watching our tournaments or the data that we receive that the best players at either win a disproportionate amount of the time. So whether or not they're testing different skills is, we can talk about that. But certainly there are abilities being leveraged in both formats in spite of these ostensibly random elements being defining features of both.
Next up, we got a question from Anyway. Is there any place for control decks that are very light on units in the game? Oftentimes when those kind of decks get popular, they get nerfed into a very sorry state. And obviously a super popular question. Some people really, really enjoy playing with control strategies. And the first thing I would say is that it's not that we inherently mind somebody not playing with units. It's more like, why are you not playing with units? Is it because you think you're going to get a real big advantage in this game from a bunch of cards in your opponent's hand doing literal nothing? Mm-hmm. If that's the reason why you're doing it, and if that's the nature of the metagame, well, that sounds kind of boring. It doesn't really sound that exciting for both players. But if you're doing it because you think you're trying to assemble something, you're trying to do something that's going to lead somewhere, that's going to be interesting, that's going to give your opponent an opportunity to try to do something about it. And by the same side of the coin, we're attacking this problem in other ways. You see a card like Sinister Rumors, mm-hmm. and that effect of, this card which can also kill aggressive units, but can also draw units from your void, can pull spells out of the enemy deck. These are ways to ensure that, there's maybe not as much benefit from going truly unitless because your opponent's cards won't all be dead. But then if you still want to do that, the door is open to you.
Yeah, I think there's 3 ways that unitless decks really raise a red flag for me. Not that they have necessarily no place, but why we do have a habit of going hard on them when they do manifest and start doing well in Tier 1 play. Where does the satisfying interaction from the game emerge? At a baseline, if both of us are attacking and blocking and we care about the stats at the minimum on each other's cards, that's an interactive game where we're going to be having different valuations of what matters at different points and give opportunities for combat tricks and instant speed removal to manifest in ways that are satisfying. So just at a baseline does not produce games that are particularly satisfying. And then also as far as control goes, a thing that's really important to me is once the control deck has established an advantage, they've played their harsh rule, they're up a bunch of cards. Anyone good watching the game would say, the control player is ahead and probably can't let up the game at this point. How long does it take that player to actually deal lethal damage to the opponent? Units are a pretty reliable way of making that happen pretty quickly. Of just, the board's clear, I play my 7/7, I hit you a few times, now the game's over. Decks are just all about Channel the Tempest or about, the 10 mana, the 10 cost combo cards or whatever the case may be. It is much more conducive to just we're just sitting here and I'm dead, but I guess I got to see how the game's actually going to end. And I don't think that experience is very good for either player. I don't even think that experience is good for the control player, honestly, of sitting there knowing that you have the game won and just waiting for the one card out of your market to do the thing or whatever. So I think it just lends itself to an interactive game and also a more viscerally satisfying game for both players, for units to be involved, even in the control construct. We make cards that facilitate unitless control. I mean, Harsh Rule and Sword of the Sky King are not weak cards, and those cards can set up a situation where you don't need units to win the game. So it's not a non-starter, but the burden of proof is really high for that stuff to play well, and in my opinion, way more often than not, it doesn't.
And I think a big thing that comes up when we talk about it here at the office is I think players sometimes have an impression that this is a much more sort of adversarial sort of deal than the reality that it is. They think it's like, oh, I figured out a way to build this deck because you have your own opinions about what you think makes a card game fun. You're trying to hit my deck, to hurt my deck, and you're making the game less fun for me. And in reality is it's like, if you actually end up coming to the conclusion in most formats where it's right to play with if you're trying your hardest to win and you come to the conclusion it's right to play with 0 units, 0 relic weapons, 0 things that the opponent could try to touch and interact with and deal with, that's on us. Like a card like Black Sky Harbinger, for instance, we don't get a lot of players who give us feedback of like, you know what? It's so frustrating. Black Sky Harbinger feels like it's the right thing for my control deck to play, but I just don't want to play with it.
Right.
That's not a piece of feedback we've ever gotten. Now, maybe that's how you feel at home, but you haven't made your opinion heard to us yet.
Right.
And so when we see formats and metagames and decks where it's like, it seems like it's really good in this metagame to just go hard on no units, it's like, that's a bit of a call to us. It's like, okay, what could we have done differently? What do we want to do in the future in order to facilitate players getting some things into play that are just dope and fun to play with? When a lot of the control decks were playing with Zhou, same thing. We didn't get a lot of feedback from like, I really hate having this dragon that feels like very cheap to put into my FJS deck.
Yeah, and I think the point you raised about I figured out this thing and now you're doing something about it. It's like, guess what? That's not the only thing that's like that. Guess what? Another thing that people figured out. Wow, if I play with nothing but 1-cost cards and Bandit Queen, every 5-cost card my opponent draws doesn't do anything because they're dead on turn 4. And then you go and nerf it. Like I figured out this way to ignore every 5-cost card in the game or greater. It's like, yeah, sure, I guess. But a lot of other people figured that out too, and it's just not that interesting. Why would we want that to be the game? So, it's not a non-starter. We do things to promote, theoretically, promote decks without units, but it's not a play pattern we're trying to encourage. I think you have to have basically anchoring bias from other games to assume that's a thing that we would actively prop up at a baseline because it just doesn't play that well. It just doesn't play that well.
Yep. And yeah, I think people oftentimes don't see both sides of the coin on this one because it's like, here's one way to think about it. Say we make a new card for an aggro deck that allows them to continue to spend their power in longer games, continue to have things to do. The feedback we typically get on those kinds of things is, oh my gosh, Direwolf hates control again. But here's another way to think about it. If we actually give the aggressive strategies some things to do that allow them to continue to spend their power, continue to have decisions to make, continue to have actions and hope in the game, it really makes it possible for there to be stronger control strategies because because the format won't be about like, well, once the aggro deck gets harsh ruled once, the game is over.
Yeah, and also it's also a more satisfying game for both players to play. Like if you're playing some Felon control deck and I'm playing Stone Scar and I have a Pyro Knight in my deck and the vast majority of games is just a 2-1 for 1, but every once in a while it lets me win a long game, or every once in a while even though you are ahead, it's not like a lock that you've won the game because I have this thing that can catch me up like 5 or 10% of the time. So it's like, that's so much more fun for both of us than exactly just like Black Sky Arbiter and now all your Grenons are dead and now it's just, or I won on turn 5 and that was the whole game. Like having both of those things as part of the range is good, but it can't be the entire range. We want to have it where you have some tools for playing a short game. Like you play your 2/5 on turn 3 and it's like, oh, wow, that's like really good right now. I can't attack through it.
Yep.
Or I have a few tools that actually let me to play a little bit on turn 7 and your advantage, but not 100%. Like that's just, I think that range is a lot more satisfying than the polar ends.
Yeah, we went pretty deep on that question, but we know it's one that comes up a lot. And it makes total amount of sense. If you see us make changes that affect one kind of play more than others, one in the patch is maybe more slanted one way, it's very natural to feel like that's sort of our view. And I would say in reality, we have all kinds of play in mind and we're trying to promote them all and we're trying to make them all coexist. In a lot of ways, we're like one big family that's all trying to live under one house. And and some of us like punk rock and some of us want to listen to classical music. And, we got to find ways to make that mesh, to make that mix. And that's the fun of all this for us, for you to figure out. And that's where sort of we're heading and we're looking.
Yeah, and to complete the analogy, the answer isn't, well, you just live at opposite sides of the house.
Yeah.
We need to make that experience good, knowing that these different groups are going to be interacting with each other like directly, like in an oppositional way. So it's a tough challenge. some of the goals are mutually exclusive, and you just try to like balance out the things to do the most good in the world the way that you see it. And that's why a lot of these conversations are sort of evolving, because we develop new perspectives, we learn new things, we learn from cards, good and bad, that we've made. And so we don't have this cemented, there's not like this like 10 commandments posted up on the whiteboard somewhere. These are evolving conversations that occur daily, and we're always receptive to new information. So
yeah, and we know that it's like, and it's something we talk about, is it's like, we don't want to become cliche machines with this stuff.
Right.
It's like, do you want our answer to be this question, like as simple as like, we're trying to make the game the most fun for the most number of people, and then your takeaway is like, well, that sure as heck sounds like an answer that's designed to just get me to not really understand anything and just move on.
Yeah.
It doesn't really help me at all. And so, that's why we like to go deeper on a question like this, because it is so complicated and we're always learning, just as you all are.
Right.
So where are we looking at, Tom? Do you think we got time for more questions? Where we want to head?
Yeah, we've got a lot of questions lined up. I'd say let's do one more, and then we can get into the live.
One more. All right. So pretty fun question. Can we do the Plunder question? I think that would be a fun one. Abednego asked, Plunder is a fantastic mechanic which make those sets more consistent, skill-based, and fun to play IMO, with fewer games wasted to power problems, especially in draft. Would you consider making Plunder evergreen and bringing it back for future sets, perhaps even adding it onto weaker 1 and 2 drops from earlier sets? Talking to you, Mr. Doorbot. On the last point, that's something we look for opportunities on. I don't think I think it's extremely insulting to Helpful Doorbot to suggest that Helpful Doorbot needs Plunder to be helpful.
The greatest game I ever played in Eternal was against our former colleague Ben Lundquist, who went turn 1 Helpful Doorbot Warp a Shiv. Just like, that's the most beautiful turn. It's so much free stuff.
I can do better. I can do better. The power had to be a banner. Oh no, well then you wouldn't be able to play the Doorbot. Dang.
No. It was a fire sigil, but it was still.
That's good.
It was
good
a beautiful turn.
As to the but we do look for opportunities like that. We'll see what happens in the future. Senway Smuggler. I don't think I'm like mincing any words to say the Stone Scar Smuggler. We weren't thrilled with the version we shipped, and so then when we came up with Decay as a mechanic, and we were looking at it, it's like, oh, that smuggler, that centaur smuggler out there in the wasteland, that looks like if we did some art reworking, that thing could have Decay, and that I think that's been a real fun change that works out. And we're not trying to like mess too much with the flow of space time and all of that, but when cool opportunities like that arise, we do try to take advantage of them.
So my perspective, and again, a lot of this is like this sort of platform is very interesting to me, because on one hand, you and I are sort of representatives of design, but also a lot of things I'm saying are just my opinion that I know designers disagree, like other designers I work with disagree with. So you can take, none of this is meant to be like canon or whatever. It's just sort of like perspectives that we have. I really like Plunder a lot. There are two things that give me some reservation about it in heavy doses. And again, you may disagree, but this is just my perspective. One is, it is sort of a baffling, like, you have to have some fluency, I think, with Eternal for that decision to be satisfying. Otherwise, it's sort of like, what's going on here? Once you understand, I'm trying to balance out the amount of power that I have, and this is smoothing out hands that are too long on action or too short on action. But if you showed a Plunder card to someone who is playing the tutorial, it would be like, what is going on here exactly? So I have some hesitation around, like, what is it for the new player experience? And then second is, I think that Plunder works best in small doses. There's really loud diminishing returns on that mechanic. The second time you plunder is typically a lot less powerful than the first time that you're plundering, because like, how often do you need that many extra power? And also, the treasures start really slowing you down once you have a lot of them. They become pretty clunky. And so all of that to me suggests a mechanic that's really, really good, but probably in relatively small doses, which is, that doesn't necessarily mean we couldn't do it evergreen. We could do it evergreen in small doses, but it's not something where I would want like 10% of our cards to say Plunder on them. I just don't think it plays particularly well in that level of saturation, and I think the new player experience with it is not ideal.
Yeah, and I think there's also, certain mechanics and keywords are a little bit more overlapping than others. Like, you know, I think there's a lot of really cool distinct parts of the experience when you take a look at something like Spark, but also Onslaught, for instance. Like, okay, they both sort of give your units some summon effect, but one keys off if they connected, but one is just if they attacked, and we balance them differently. But it would be a little bit odd, and it wouldn't maybe be as satisfying to play against if they were showing up at the same time.
Right.
And that's the similar sort of thing in that, like, we definitely hear you in terms of, like, do you want to get Plunder? We think Plunder was dope, and it was a great way to give players some more agency with regards to smoothing out their draws. Now, the thing is like you and I earlier, we were talking about some pretty cool mechanics in the space of, like, helping players do some things like that. Now, we could just trash all of that work. I think they're going to really like it to just bring back Plunder, but, you know, we'll see.
Yeah. No, I mean, but that is actually, I mean, that's a way to hand wave it, but it's also true. Like, we'll see.
Yeah.
We have a sense. We wouldn't explore these mechanics if we didn't have confidence that they were going to be fun and resonant and fulfill some mechanical goals and sort of like engine needs along the way. But also, like, we have sent mechanics out the door where we look back and was like, wow, that went a lot better than we were expecting. And we've had the opposite experience as well. So, like, we just kind of learn as we go. But I think doing adjacent but not exactly the same stuff, we still have it in our back pocket. That doesn't take Plunder off the table, but it's new and it's novel, and the puzzle's a little bit different, and it does certain things better and certain things worse. And, like, why not just explore the entire range of the game engine?
Yeah, and I mean, and this sort of speaks to how we generally take feedback from players and also internally, is we don't ever want to be in a spot where we're taking anybody too literally.
Right.
It's like you ask, like, can you bring back Plunder? And all I hear is like, well, no, we're not going to. And then I move on. But in reality, what we hear is, like, when you say things like, can you unnerf this card? Can you bring back this mechanic? Is we try to get into the weeds about it, which is like, you know, we don't try to speak for you or assume too much, but we do want to try to understand if, and, you know, I'm sure Chad will correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say, like, somebody likes Plunder, what I'm hearing is like, I really like mechanics that give me a lot of options for how to use my cards, that allow me to help have a smoother power draw and things like that. And it's like, okay, well, maybe I don't know exactly when Plunder will come back because, you know, future plans, the future is is still up in the air with a lot of things, but that sort of need, that sort of desire is something, well, we'll see.
Yeah, if you're like, oh, I like modal cards, I like the option of being able to give up a little bit of tempo to smooth out some of the unevenness of my early draws. It's like, that makes a lot of sense why someone would like that. And there's a lot of ways to go about doing it too. So let's try to figure out, you know, ways that are novel, ways that make the puzzle a little bit different, ways that hit a different story beat, a different flavor, you know. And then there's no reason not to go back to Plunder when it's appropriate, or, you know, when we have a set that's especially well suited for it, but we don't need to just hammer that one thing over and over again because we know it is effective in certain ways.
Well, you got to let the treasure build back up.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you can't just deplete that overnight.
It gets spent, and then, you know, you gotta. It's like anything else. You gotta wait.
All right. So Tom, it sounds like maybe we got a few questions from live. You're going to be reading to us. Our producer Tom joining us to that.
Yes, we do. We've got a few questions, and our first one is from Tempest Dragon King.
Oh, nice.
What is your favorite deck that's come from the community? I know there's been some sweet ones.
Do you have one that comes to mind? I got to ponder on it.
We gotta. Don't we have to give the question to the audience here? Because Tom was just talking to our headset. They don't know what we're about to answer.
Yes. No, he's talking at his mic.
Oh, great. Okay,
yes.
I thought he was just into us.
Yeah. No, we got
Apologies.
that set up.
Wonderful.
So favorite deck that the community built. I think I would go with Haunted Highway. To me, that was just such a cool piece of, like, different pieces coming together. Sometimes you were combusting with Grenadin Drone, but sometimes you were building up and getting a berserking Bandit Queen with them and all sorts of things like that. And I thought the way that the community iterated on that and figured that out was super cool.
Yeah, it's tough when you've built every deck.
Oh, come on.
What is your favorite community deck? Haunted Highway is a great choice because that feels like a it's very fluid in the way that it plays. It has this, like, blend of aggressive and disruptive elements, and feels like a very digital. It's like leaning into very digital space.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to go with that as an answer. I'm going to come back to this. I need to think.
All right.
It's like, what did they come up with that I didn't come up with first? It's like, you talk about the future, but the past is tricky too, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Anyhow, sorry, Tom. I don't mean
Well,
to.
I don't think anything actually ever happened in the world before March 2020. I think that's been established.
Yeah, I mean, I got some kids, but I don't know where they came
Yeah.
from, if I'm being honest.
All right.
Tom, what you got for me?
So this is from LightsOutAce. To wrap this into the channel's purpose, is turn 6 a fundamental turn Direwolf is aiming for in Throne right now? Do you intend to continue nerfing things that violate this, like Eccentric Officer, and clear the way, or will it continue to get faster over time?
Well, we're always trying to make cards that have something that makes them better or different or more useful than the existing cards, because otherwise, why would anybody ever need to get more cards in the game? There has to be something attractive, and I think anybody watching isn't unfamiliar with the concept of power creep, the idea that maybe over time it becomes easier. It's like, oh, we used to do this thing at about 3 cost, but now we can maybe do something with a little bit less utility. It's maybe around like 2.5 cost too. And those sorts of ideas, things just keep getting better. Maybe the format gets faster. I don't think the format necessarily needs to get faster just because the cards are getting stronger. If we were to, for instance, make let's just say hypothetically, this is not happening, but let's say that in the next set, there was something that was basically like Black Sky Harbinger, but was like 5 cost and dealt like 3 to everything. I bet you the format starts feeling a lot slower in that world, for instance. But in terms of a fundamental turn, I wouldn't say that's a term that maybe you've picked up from another game. But I wouldn't say that's really how we approach it, because we're really trying to dig into the details. And I think the last balance patch reflects that, is like, what's going on in these games with some of these decks and strategies, and what is the opportunities, what tools can players turn to. For instance, one of the things that we did, I think people picked up on, was like a bunch more removal effects became fast. And it was like, okay, so there's decks that are, maybe applying a lot of pressure on you. Making a card like Slay Better isn't particularly likely, by making it fast and allowing it to be a little more flexible at answering things, isn't necessarily going to make the format faster. And so we're always trying to get in that good balance between, pressure, reaction, counterplay, and all of these sorts of things, and not really trying to be like, well, once we get to this turn of the game, then it's okay for the game to turn into complete and utter nonsense.
Yeah, I think the describing things in the sense of a fundamental turn doesn't really describe my approach. I know some designers, it's like a useful tool, but it's not really how I think about it. It's like, I think the game should have enough different things going on and enough replayability and enough ambiguity that what's the fundamental turn, what's the fundamental exchange, what's the inflection point in this matchup. It shouldn't be something that you can just summarize in one sentence. Sometimes it's going to go that way. In the more extreme cases, like, your Bandit Queen Stone Scar deck is like, whether or not you had Harsh Rule on turn 5, that's going to be the game a lot of the time. It's okay for that to be some of what's going on. But I don't want the game to be sort of like transparently balanced around, this is the turn where there's an inflection point in who's in control of the game, or now we're pivoting to a resource accrual, or we're just trading haymakers. Again, having that as part of the range is totally fine, but I don't think the target should be, the games are balanced around turn end being the time where a particular range of things are happening. I think it should just be different from matchup to matchup, and ideally even inside the same matchup, depending on how the cards are drawn, depending on just like things that are happening, each game just feels different in that respect.
And it's not sometimes if you want to and I don't mean to be more critical of this fundamental turn concept, because I think in a lot of ways it does have a lot of merit. And I think when you talk about it, it's like, for a deck like, maybe what Talir Combo was in its fully powered up form, when you had access to Kairos and Vodacon as a ways to completely go off, well, you maybe couldn't necessarily define the fundamental turn for that deck in terms of a number, but the fundamental turn for that deck was every single time that deck would put Talir into play and then go into the market and just combo off on the spot. Mm-hmm. And so one way, I guess if you want to say that we do use the fundamental turn concept, is it's like, how much variety is there in terms of how the games play out?
Right.
And if it's always because of the same thing, whether it's like it's always with Yetis, it's like, did you immediately have an answer to match up well against Snowcrest Yeti and some of the most aggressive elements of those Blazing Salvo decks? Sort of the Houndmaster is one where we tried to pull back, make it a little bit easier to catch up against by reducing the health. And broadly what I'm speaking to is this idea of it's like the games could go in multiple ways. And if the games are always going in one direction, that's oftentimes going to be more the case of something we need to pull back on.
Yeah, I think if you want to go way back in Eternal's history, I think an instructive example would be, let's say the first set Cumbre mirrors, where there are definitely key interaction points or key spots of the, like, you know, do you have your Mystic Ascendant in power in one turn, or you know, do you have Seraph on time, and you know, like, so 8 power is an inflection point, 11 power can be an inflection point because you want to Seraph and do it in the same turn in case they have a silence effect for your Seraph. You don't want to spew it off. But even though there were some common, you know, situations that you could describe or parts where one player would be advantaged, sometimes someone went like Seraph into Sandstorm Titan and just won the game. Sometimes the game went on for a million turns, and actually the Great Parliament ended up being the card that mattered the most, even though that card was pretty modest in the Sandstorm Titan, Mystic Ascendant, Seraph sort of context of cards. And I think the pieces can be different, and maybe that mirror match is a little too slow for our DL target. I think it is too slow, but that's a really good example of the thing that I'm talking about, of like, there are definitely key exchanges and key cards in the matchup, but it's not just like a checklist of interactions. There's more ambiguity, there's more, you know, room to maneuver, there's more opportunities for weird one-ups to manifest, and that to me that's the thing to look for, and not like, is turn 6 or turn 7 the turn where things start happening of substance in mid-range matchups or whatever.
Yeah, the games are fine. And we should put some respect on that name. World champion, LightsOutAce.
World champion.
Great question.
Appreciate you checking in.
Yes.
All right, we've got a question here from Kurtis. Has there been any talk about adding team events to the game?
Well, team events are super fun, and they certainly can be. And you know, we see that sometimes in our community tournament series that we help sponsor, Tuesday Night Eternal, that they do some occasional team events. You know, I think in terms of where we're looking and what we would be thinking about, it's not an idea that maybe that we can sort of say anything definitive on right now, one way or the other. But it's, you know, one of the big challenges would be is it's like we really like having the game be very easy and pick up to play, and it's like you don't maybe need to have a headset, or you can just pick up on your phone, do all these sorts of things. And so I guess one of the challenges, and I'm just more speaking sort of myself as a designer, would be how do I deliver sort of all of the awesome team-like experiences of allowing somebody to really have a hand, think about what they want to do, make a play, but also have it feel like it's a team experience.
To me, that feels much more something that's like the purview of the community tournaments. I think it's great to allow players to select for that kind of event, because if they're enjoy playing games socially. A lot of people enjoy games like Eternal because they're even though there's an opponent, they're basically playing just a single player experience. And then there's just like a level of investment, a level of community building that's like, it's great for people to get to that point. And I bet the people that are in Discord and Twitch right now probably biased towards that demographic of being really heavily invested in and loving that sort of thing. But is that servicing the player base at large as an in-client feature versus other things we could spend our resources on? That to me is a much more questionable thing, because I think that those sort of team events are kind of, they cater towards a very invested demographic of player who can avail themselves of sort of third-party resources to get a lot of what's going on there that's positive. And you know, it's not necessarily the most efficient use of our resources to figure out a way to try to get that experience in the client.
Awesome. And we've got a question here from the great hero Beowulf. There's been a lot of talk about the game focus on units and interaction, but it feels we're having a chupacabra issue here with powerful unit effects we cannot interact. Either entering play or activated effects we cannot respond to.
With a what issue?
Chupacabra.
Chupacabra. Any plans to address this?
So maybe I think the person might be speaking to the idea that, you know, you don't always get a chance to play a spell in response to a unit with a summon and then stop the summon. And so can we balance a game where it is naturally harder to stop a unit's effect, or some of them?
Yeah, I think we can balance the game around that.
Yeah.
I think that we can do suffocate on a unit, and that unit's not supposed to cost 1 like suffocate does, and that's suffocate's advantage. But the fact that the unit would suffocate on it is a 2-for-1, or has some other context, or is easier to recur, or has a unit type that matters, and that's all part of it. It's like, yeah, we can totally balance the game around both of those cards having a place in a competitive ecosystem.
And sometimes you're always trying to think of like, how do I hard stop this thing at the moment that it's happening? But the reality is there is effects. If we were trying to make it easier to interact with summon effects, we silence a unit in the enemy's hand, and then that's something where, well, all of a sudden now the unit really doesn't have a summon, does it? And It's not going to be doing its thing. A unit picking up Aegis in response to a summon. And so it's not necessarily the case that you might literally be able to hard, let's pause the game, do you want to turn off this summon? But there is still a lot of different ways and a variety of ways for both us as designers and then ultimately for players to think about and approach the problem of, my enemy is going to be playing something with a summon, what am I going to do in response?
Exactly. And a lot of the work you have to do up front, right? Like, your opponent has Outland Sniper's not the best example necessarily because it's not pushed enough for tier 1, but like, if you know that's cards in your opponent's deck, do you make an effort to trade off your 2/2 to potentially make that card harder for your opponent to leverage in a spot where normally you wouldn't trade off your 2/2. Like, there's that sort of sideways counterplay as well. Or sometimes you just roll the dice and risk it for reasons X, Y, and Z. But like, that's good gameplay. That's not something to shy away from.
Awesome. And I think we've got time for 2 more questions here. This one hopefully should be pretty easy for you. It comes from Jed the Homarid. What is your favorite sigil and your favorite premium version of that sigil, or a sigil?
My favorite sigil is Time, and it's the stone carved ones. Chat might be able to remind me about when exactly we released those. They're the ones where they look like, instead of, most of the time the sigils are sort of fully colored in for their faction, and these ones it was a dark hue that made it feel like this was like an ancient, more earthy sort of sigil, and those are my personal favorites.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm definitely a Stone Scar guy. I really enjoy the working in the mines motif. Part of that sort of, I don't want to say blue collar necessarily because I'm here and doing a stream about a video game and sweatpants. There's a certain blue collar affect to that I really appreciate, that is at odds with having premium copies of cards. So I'd have to go and look, but my default, even on my gifted accounts or whatever with everything, I try to play with the defaults. I don't, it's an ideological project, I guess. But probably if I'm being honest, probably one of the shiny fire sigils. If I'm, honestly,
let's keep it real. Let's keep it real.
But I default to non-premiums just as a matter of course.
Man of the people.
Yeah.
All right, so the last question we've got here that we're going to have time for today is from Stormblessed. What are some nerfs that you personally were sad to have to implement, even though they might have been necessary for the health of the game overall?
Wow, that's a good question. Here's the... I don't want to get in trouble. Do you have an answer? I'll think about my answer.
I have an answer. It's from the back to closed beta. Turning burnout from 3 cost to 4 cost. I just thought we were coming in way too heavy. Even the way that it went out the door might have been a little too heavy, but who knows? It's you don't really know the alternative world of just like how good cheap fire aggro that was not easy to interact with was. I remember when we were working on the closed beta being like, all right, so we're doing Power Knight and Oni Ronin and Granite Drone and the Taking Granite, which is also like not weak, especially if burnout is pushed. And it's like, if we believe in this play pattern, that's fine, but like we're gonna make more sets. We don't need to do it all at once. And can we just like pull back on some of the like less interactive part of that range, or the more bursty part of that range? And so it was painful for me in some respects because I do, as a player, enjoy that play pattern. But I just thought it would be safe to just pull back a little bit on that experience when we were trending towards open beta.
Yeah, it's tricky for me. I don't get sad about nerfs as much, mostly because one, we talk about the idea that like we're, part of what we're doing here is we're both speaking for like the team and what we think, but also you can't totally separate your own sensibilities.
Right.
And I'm just like I'm always like, let's shake up the globe. Like let's do some stuff. Let's see some stuff different. And I'm a very curious person by nature, and so it's like almost like when we get to nerf things, it's almost like, well, I wonder what the world looks like this. It's almost like those fork in the road, sliding doors kind of moments where it's like, how does things go differently? But in terms of a nerf that I was sad that we had to do, I'll go with Arc of Soul. I'll stick to being a time guy. And it obviously, how awesome was it that you get to just get off to all these busted starts with your time decks, like almost every single game playing with it. But and you could still get off to a nice, quick, fast acceleration with Arc of Soul in the game right now. But there was a period of time where that card was pretty nuts.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what you said about the alternate worlds and getting to see like what would things look like if they were slightly different. That's part of what I enjoy about working on Eternal and have enjoyed about the game is like actually getting to experience the counterfactuals. And so it's hard for me to like mourn too much at any one particular change because it's just like, well, if we pull back on something, that just means something else gets an opportunity to shine. Or we made this removal spell worse, and now some of the stuff that removal spell was good against might have an opportunity to show up. Like I just like seeing the way the ecosystem flourishes in different ways under different parameters, and with different tent poles being the major part of it. But yeah, I guess it's probably more useful to answer that question as a player. And yet for me, it was. I had to push pretty hard on the burnout nerf because it wasn't like it was one of the 5 best cards in Fire even in set 1 at the time. It was just, we don't need to do all this all at once. Can we ease up a little bit on this? We can always buff this card down the line, make another version we're happier with, but like let's not come out of the chute with like a ready to be a pre-con Fire aggro deck that's going to be the best or second best deck in the metagame.
Yeah, and I guess part of the way I took that question was like, to me, it's not even that I'm like that sad about the fact that Arc of Soul is nerfed and it is a healthier place, because the way that I was using it when I was playing on live was I was playing with it to accelerate into a lot jankier of time cards at times. Like I like to experience the range. And so, yeah, my Mask of Torment decks were quite a bit better, but that's not necessarily the way that everyone was using it. So maybe, things needed to change and shake up there a little.
Right.
All right. So, yeah, that's going to do it. But, I think everyone, hopefully people are happy to see us. If you haven't joined us for one of our tournaments, it's worth wrapping up by just noting that we have a Throne tournament starting on Friday. It's a Throne Open. If you go to the 2021 World Championships page, and if you search that, Eternal 2021 World Championships, and you're not familiar with our competitive play scene, go there first. You'll get the lowdown. But if you've played any of our tournaments in the past, we got another tournament where anybody can join. The winner is going to be going to our World Championships. It's going to be a lot of fun. We'll be doing commentary and coverage of it this weekend. And yeah, we had a big patch last week that affected a lot of things in Throne, and we're excited, like you all are, to see what's going to shake out, what's going to go on top, and where the metagame's going to go from here. We've gotten a lot of bold predictions about what is going to win and be the best. Maybe one of them will be true because we've gotten a lot of them, but they all can't be true at this point.
But if you got a prediction, the easiest way to find out is trying to qualify and win.
Yeah.
So if you're not familiar with these tournaments, there's open play through Friday and Saturday, and that's asynchronous. So you don't have to be logged in at a particular time. You just have to get through your 4 runs. After that, the top 64 records compete on Sunday in a single elimination tournament that, again, Andrew Baeckstrom and I will be back here in these seats to cover on Sunday. So if you've never played in any of our events before, if you're not familiar with our organized play structure, don't have to worry about any of it. You can log into the client on Friday, sign up, play your matches through Friday and Saturday at your own leisure. And if you do well enough, you'll get an opportunity to compete for the World Championship, cash prizes, and a whole lot of other stuff as we cover the event here on Sunday.
And then, yeah, I guess one thing that we shook some things up with the organized play system this year. One thing to shout out is, maybe not everybody's like, oh, I'm ready to play in a tournament, I'm ready to compete and win. Is that, for those 28 games that you play on Friday and Saturday to try to make it to the top 64, and when you sign up, if you've reached Masters in any of Draft, Expedition, or Throne this month or the prior month, it means you get to sign up with a Mastery Pass. It doesn't expire. It expires, you have to be within the last 2 months. But what that gets you is it gets you 2 buys to start, and it gets you premium copies of whatever the alternate art is going to be for that week's Open. And this time coming up, it's a card we talked about, some exploits. So get some premium exploits this weekend if you've got a Mastery Pass.
And we know from our analytics that a lot of people register for the tournament under these circumstances without even the intent of playing their 28 matches and trying to qualify just for those premium cards. So if that's how you're wired, you're more than welcome to do that. But once you're registered, you can also give it a run and see if you can make it to Sunday where, again, 64-player single elimination tournament, a lot of cash prizes, and an opportunity to qualify for our World Championships.
And you get to have your matches on camera. That could be fun, too.
Us two chuckleheads talking about
plays
you're making.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
What an opportunity, huh? So come on by. Again, Friday is when these queues start, and you can the client's self-explanatory, so you can just hop in there and get going and see how these new throne changes look, both from the deck that you're playing and what the competition has as well.
So this was fun. This was our first time sort of doing one of these streams, and I imagine we're going to be doing more stuff out in the community now that we're sort of back in the flow of things a little bit again, back in the office and all of that, and I'm excited for that. It's going to be a lot of fun, and appreciate all the great questions people sent in. We know we couldn't get to all of them, but you can expect to see more of us hanging around on the Discord, and we'll see, and hopefully maybe we'll be able to get to your question in the future, and we'll just have to take it from there. Any parting thoughts, Mr. Sullivan?
No, this was really fun. Had a great time. A lot of really thoughtful questions. So thanks for everyone who participated. And, like we said at the top of the show, no promises just yet, but I have a feeling this is going to become a recurring theme and something in some form or fashion. So thanks for everyone who helped make this initial launch a success, and hopefully we will see you around these parts pretty soon.